capital formation. There are fewer investments, which damages the abilities of business to grow, to create jobs, or to pay higher wages. I challenge my colleagues to ask a room full of economists this question: does increasing the cost of capital lead to higher or lower economic growth and job creation? Well, the answer is obvious. As President Kennedy said when he endorsed a capital gains tax cut, quote, "The tax on capital gains directly affects investment decisions, the mobility and the risk flow of capital, as well as the ease or difficulty experienced by new ventures in obtaining capital, and thereby the strength and potential for growth in the economy," end of quote. It's also important to remember that we're not making tax policy in a vacuum here. We're competing for capital and investments with every other nation on earth. The President has conceded that our high corporate tax rate harms our international competitiveness and has expressed tepid support for lowering it. But those benefits would be erased if capital gains taxes are increased dramatically. As the Wall Street Journal points out, and I quote, "Lowering the corporate tax rate makes the U.S. more competitive, but the tax change is self-defeating if it's combined with an even larger rise in the investment income taxes on capital gains and dividends," end of quote. According to a recent Ernst & Young study, the integrated tax rate on capital gains is already over 50%, 50.8% to be exact. That's more than twice the rate in China, for example. If Congress does nothing, capital gains rates will rise again to 56.7% next year. That's the second highest in the world. If the Buffett tax increase is layered on top, taxes will consume almost two-thirds of capital gains and will have the highest integrated rate by far of any of our international competitors. We have to remember, in a mobile world economy, capital is highly mobile. Does anyone believe that such a confiscatory capital gains rate imposed by the Buffett tax wouldn't lead to less investment in the United States and more in other countries? As somebody said, this isn't just shooting ourselves in the foot, it's shooting ourselves in the head. Fourth, let me address President Obama's suggestions that the Buffett tax somehow constitutes fundamental tax reform and that President Reagan would have supported it. I think I can imagine President Reagan responding, "Well, there you go again." Washington Post has a fact-checker op-ed, and here's how they set the record straight on President Obama's claim that he was pushing the same concept, his words, as President Reagan. Quote, Washington Post, "Contrary to Obama's suggestion that President Reagan was specifically arguing for a new tax provision aimed at the super-wealthy, Reagan was barnstorming the country in an effort to reduce taxes for all Americans, mainly by cutting rates, simplifying the tax system, and eliminating tax shelters that allowed some people to avoid paying any taxes at all. In other words, Reagan was pushing for a tax cut for everyone, not just an increase on a few. Obama and Reagan did use similar anecdotes and even the phrase, quote, fair share, but in service of different goals," end of quote. President Reagan's tax reform should never be confused with a harmful political gimmick like the Buffett tax. Fifth, I'd like to show how higher capital gains taxes have a negative effect on revenue. Ever since the bipartisan capital gains cut in 1978, a pattern has repeated itself over and over again. Raising the capital gains rate reduces revenues. Lowering it has led to revenue increases. That's partly because capital gains taxes are an elective tax. The tax is only paid when investors sell their assets, and frequently they wait to sell their assets for the rates to go down, when it will cost them less to sell those assets. The Wall Street Journal recently produced a chart to this effect, and I'm just going to summarize it. In 1978, President Carter signed an amendment into law which cut the capital gains rate from 40 to 28%. What was the result? Less revenue? No. Revenue from capital gains increased by nearly $3 billion, and yet the rate was reduced. Congress cut the capital gains rate again to 20% in 1981 as part of the Reagan tax cuts. As the Journal notes, revenue did not fall in 1982. By 1983, capital gains revenue soared to $18.7 billion. Lower rate, higher revenue. In 1986, the capital gains tax rate was returned to 28% as part of the tax reform package. And guess what? Revenues soared as investors cashed in their gains before the tax increase hit, and then plunged in 1987. The point is, investors get to play. They get to decide. When the rate goes down, they can sell their property with less cost. When the rate goes up, they hang on to their property. They don't sell it because they'll have to pay more when they do. In 1997, President Clinton and congressional Republicans cut the rate back to 20%, and revenues from capital gains doubled by the year 2000 to $127.63 billion. As the Journal notes, and I quote, "Congress shouldn't be fooled by government forecasters who predict a revenue boom from a higher capital gains rate. They've blown this call every time." End of quote. My last point addresses what the Buffett tax would do for the federal debt. The answer is next to nothing. Let's examine the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation's estimate of the revenue that would be raised from the Buffett tax. And bear in mind that these estimates do not include the effect on economic growth, which could dramatically reduce rather than raise federal revenues, as history has shown. But let's take the score at face value. Even without counting the negative impact on the economy, the Buffett tax would raise a mere pittance in the scope of federal budgets. When President Obama first proposed the tax, he declared that it could raise enough money, I'm quoting now, could raise enough money to stabilize our debt and deficits for the next decade. He said, "This is not politics, it's math." Well, let's look at the math. The Joint Committee on Taxation estimate shows that the Buffett tax would raise only about $1 billion this year. So instead of a deficit this year of $1,079 billion, we'd have a deficit of $1,078 billion. That doesn't exactly raise enough money to stabilize our debt and deficits for the next decade, as the President said. Over the first 5 years, the Joint Tax Committee shows that the Buffett tax would collect about $14.7 billion. To put it in perspective, that will amount to less than 0.08% of the projected national debt in 5 years. And in the year 2014, the proposal is estimated to actually lose over $6 billion in revenue. Why is this? Again, because capital gains taxes are largely voluntary. The investors targeted by the Buffett tax are generally able to decide when to sell an asset. They can manipulate their sale to stay below the triggering threshold of $1 million in the bill. This produces a lock-in effect on capital as investments stay stagnant. So what's the end result? Little, if any, revenue is actually raised. Business investments decline. In turn, wages and hiring decline. Again, if the purpose of taxes is to raise needed revenue rather than punish people, this bill completely flunks the test. So while this proposed tax increase might make some people feel good, it won't solve any of our budget problems. It will likely destroy jobs and growth. And as history has shown, depressed economic growth from a tax increase will likely make our budget problems even worse than they are now. So in conclusion, Mr. President, the economy, as we know, is limping along at an anemic growth rate. Gas is $4 a gallon or more, and 20 million Americans are unemployed or underdeployed. The economic downturn has taken a huge toll on American families. They want Washington to focus on legislation that will have an impact on jobs and gas prices. Instead, we're debating a show bill that has no chance of passing, wouldn't create a single American job. What happened to jobs, jobs, jobs? Remember that three-letter word, jobs? Well, the President claims to be focused like a laser on the economy. Instead, it appears that there's only one job that he's focused on with this political proposal. I submit that here in the Senate, Mr. President, we should be focused on jobs and energy legislation that can pass, not tax hikes through show votes that are designed to fail.
Mr. President. Senator from Vermont. Thank you, Mr. President. And I rise in strong support of the Paying a Fair Share Act, and I commend Senator Whitehouse for introducing this important legislation. Mr. President, it is absurd that at a time when our country has a $15 trillion national debt and enormous unmet needs, the wealthiest people in this country have an effective tax rate that is lower than many middle-class workers. It makes no sense that the richest 400 people in our country, who earned an average of more than $270 million each in 2008, pay an effective tax rate of just 18%, which is less than many small businessmen, nurses, teachers, police officers, etc. That is wrong from a moral perspective. It is also very bad economic policy. But, Mr. President, the issue we are debating today really speaks to a much larger crisis that is taking place in America. And that is that in many important ways, the United States is departing from its democratic tradition, which has always included a strong and growing middle class, and is moving rapidly into an oligarchic form of government in which almost all wealth and power reside in the hands of the very richest people in our society, the top 1%. That, Mr. President, is not what America is supposed to be about. Let me mention to you a recent study which shows not only why we should pass this Buffett Rule, but why we should go, in fact, much further. An economist at the University of California, Professor Emanuel Sayers, studying tax returns, found that in 2010, 93% of all new income generated during that year went to the top 1%. Let me repeat that. Between 2009 and 2010, the last year we have statistics on this issue, 93% of all new income went to the top 1%, while the rest of the people, the bottom 99%, were able to receive 7%. Even more incredible is the fact that 37% of that new income went to the top 100th of 1%. In other words, of the $309 billion in new income gained in 2010, $288 billion went to the top 1%. Only $21 billion in new income went to the bottom 99%. Mr. President, today the top 1% earns over 20% of all income in this country, which is more than the bottom 50%. In terms of distribution of wealth, accumulated income, as hard as it may be for us to believe as a country which believes in mobility, in a country which believes in equality, today we have a situation where the 400 wealthiest people in America now own more wealth than the bottom half of America, 150 million people. 400 people here own more wealth than the bottom 150 million Americans, and that gap between the very rich and everybody else is now wider than it has been in this country since the late 1920s, and we have by far the most unequal distribution of income and wealth of any major country on earth. So that is where we are today as a nation, and it is not a good place to be. The richest people and largest corporations are doing phenomenally well, while the middle class is collapsing and poverty increases. This is not what democracy looks like. This is what oligarchy and plutocracy look like. And to compound this extremely unfair situation, when millionaires and billionaires are paying nearly the lowest effective tax rate for the rich in decades, our deficit problems only grow worse. In other words, not only are the real and effective tax rates for the rich lower than many middle-class workers, their low effective tax rates are having a very negative impact on our deficit. In fact, today, as a result of the tax breaks given to the wealthy and large corporations, revenue as a percentage of GDP is at 14.8%, the lowest in more than 50 years. So, Mr. President, let us pass the Buffett Rule today, but let us do much more in the future. Instead of cutting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education, and other programs of vital importance to middle-class and working families in this country, as many of my Republican colleagues would like to do, let us develop both personal and corporate tax policies which are fair and which protect the best interests of our country. Nobody should be talking about maintaining huge tax breaks for millionaires and billionaires and in the same breath talk about cutting Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the needs of our children and the needs of the most vulnerable people in our country. That is wrong, and that is not what America is about. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
President,
Senator from Rhode Island.
how much time remains?
Senator from Rhode Island has 3 minutes,
And on the Republican side?
and the Republicans have 4 minutes.
4 minutes. It's my understanding, Mr. President, that there are no further speakers on the Republican side. So if somebody does come, I will, of course, yield the 4 minutes. But the latest report is that there are no further speakers until we move on to the judicial nomination. I just wanted to use the time that remains to respond to 2 of the points that have been made. Before I do that, let me just say that as I have kept track during the debate, the minority party has discussed debt, bureaucracy, presidential appointments, punishment of success, Obamacare, jobs, fuel prices, picking winners and losers, campaign contributions, out-of-control spending, equal opportunity, and massive new tax increases. Subject at hand is actually much smaller than this, and that is the undisputed and indisputable fact that at the very, very high end of the American income spectrum, people are paying lower tax rates than regular American families. Whether it's Warren Buffett's self-proclaimed example of paying only 11% in total taxes, or the average of all the 400 highest income earners in the country being only 18.2%, these are people earning, in the case of the 400, over $250 million each in 1 year, and paying the rate equivalent to what a single Rhode Island truck driver pays. That's the issue. We should have a progressive tax code. Now, one of the speakers has said that we do have a progressive tax code, that the income tax generates 31.2% of the total income tax revenue from high-income folks versus 14.2% from the middle as their rate. But it's worth focusing on the fact that when my Republican colleagues talk about taxes and they focus on income taxes, they leave out the payroll taxes that virtually every American pays, that a great number of Americans pay. More pay payroll taxes than pay an income tax, I believe. And if you look at all of those taxes and you put them together, you find that the top 1% of Americans do indeed pay 28.3% of the taxes. 1% pays 28.3% of the taxes. And that sounds pretty progressive until you realize that the top 1% in America controls more than a third of the nation's wealth. The top 1% holds more than a third of the nation's wealth that pays only 28% of the taxes. That's not progressive if you're measuring in what you're usually taxing, which is income and wealth, not just the existence of a human being on the planet. If you go to 5%, then the top 5% pay 44.7% of all of our taxes, which again is a lot and is progressive, but not when you consider that that 5% owns or controls more than 60% of the nation's wealth. We are a country in which more than half of the wealth of the country, more than 60% of the wealth of the country, is concentrated in the hands of 1/20th of the population, the top 5%. And so for them to pay a higher rate makes a lot of logical sense. And what you find is that they actually pay a lower rate all too often. The other point that I'd like to address is the argument that this will take money from the pockets of small businesses. If you look at the Office of Taxation and the Treasury's definition of what a small business is, and look at how many would be affected by this bill, it would be 3.3%. Nearly 97% of small businesses would have zero effect from this bill. And of the 3.3% that would be affected, it's hard to know how many of those are simply high-income individuals who have incorporated themselves for tax purposes but don't fit the ordinary definition of a small business. When you look at the fact that Americans across this country have spent the last week sitting down, going through their receipts, filing their tax returns, sitting at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of it all and get it filed on time, for a great number of those folks, what they know from Warren Buffett and from others is that the people making $250 million a year are paying lower rates than they do, and that's not right. And it's not just me saying that that's not right. It's Ronald Reagan saying that that's not right. Ronald Reagan said that it was crazy, to use his word, crazy that a millionaire should pay a lower tax rate than a bus driver pays. And it's equally crazy that a truck driver should pay a lower rate.
The senator from Rhode Island has exhausted his time. The senator from Tennessee is here to speak.
Very well. I will yield the floor to the senator from Tennessee.
Thank you.
Mr. President, how much time might I acquire or left?
1 minute.
1 minute. Well, I'll speak very briefly. This last March, 64 senators, 32 on each side, wrote a letter to the President asking for real tax reform and real entitlement reform. I think most of us know that today's exercise is a political exercise. It's not intended to deal with deficits. It's intended to divide. I heard the President speaking to a college in Florida last week about the Buffett tax. And in that speech, he was talking about spending all of that money on things that they were interested in. In other words, this money is not being used, per the President's speech, in any way to reduce deficits. I would just encourage all of those on both sides of the aisle, 32 senators on each side, that have spoken earnestly and sincerely about pro-growth tax reform and entitlement reform to not follow this folly of division, but to hold together as we need to do something that is great for our country. And it's my hope that by later this year, possibly lame duck, although I hope that something happens sooner than that. All of us who really care about solving problems, not about scoring political points, which this bill is about, will come together and do something great for our country. And, Mr. President, I yield the time. Thank you.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination, which the clerk will report.
Nomination: Stephanie Dawn Thacker of West Virginia to be United States Circuit Judge for the Fourth Circuit.
Under the previous order, there will be 60 minutes for debate, equally divided and controlled in the usual form.
Mr. President,
Senator from Vermont.
I understand, well, let me make sure I understand the time. Time is now divided for an hour until the vote.
That is correct.
Thank you. I thank the distinguished presiding officer, and I welcome him back after the break, and all senators, both sides of the aisle. The Senate is going to consider the nomination of Stephanie Dawn Thacker of West Virginia to fill a judicial vacancy on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And I know the distinguished senator from West Virginia, Senator Manchin, will be coming here to speak in a few moments. I would note that this is a judicial vacancy in which the Senate Judiciary Committee voted unanimously, as the distinguished presiding officer will recall, in favor of this nomination more than 5 months ago. That was after thorough debate and background, and we voted for her unanimously. 5 months. She should not have had to wait this long. When she is confirmed, she'll be the first woman from West Virginia to serve in the United States Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit. She's been forced to wait 5.5 months for Senate consideration with no good reason. And I thank the Majority Leader, Senator Reid, for scheduling this vote. Chief Justice Roberts and the Attorney General both spoke about the serious problems created by these persistent judicial vacancies. More than 160 million Americans live in districts or circuits that have a judicial vacancy that can be filled today. The Senate Republicans would just agree to vote on the nominations that are pending. These are not new nominations. These are nominations pending. They've gone through the Senate Judiciary Committee. And we should act to bring an end to the harm caused by delays and overburdened courts. And I ask unanimous consent, my full statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, speaking of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I want to say as we begin to work now after the Easter Passover recess, I want to thank all the senators who come to the floor in recent weeks to express their bipartisan support for the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act. We've also emphasized, and I agree with them, the need for the Senate to take up and reauthorize this landmark legislation. For almost 18 years, the Violence Against Women Act, which is called VAWA, has been the centerpiece of the federal government's commitment to combating domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. And the impact of this landmark law has been remarkable. It has provided life-saving assistance to hundreds of thousands of men, women, children, and the annual incidence of domestic violence has dropped by 50% since the act was passed. Support for the Violence Against Women Act has always been bipartisan, and I appreciate the bipartisan support this reauthorization bill has already received. Senator Crapo and I introduced the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act in November, with Senators Heller and Ayotte joining as co-sponsors in March. We now have 61 co-sponsors in the Senate from both sides of the aisle. And I hope the Senate will take up and pass this bill soon. The Violence Against Women Act is about responding to domestic and sexual violence. Its programs are vitally important. And our legislation has looked at and learn from the experiences and needs of survivors of domestic and sexual violence from all around the country. We've also had the recommendations of those tireless professionals who work every single day, I might say virtually every single night, to serve them. It builds on the progress that's been made in reducing domestic and sexual violence. It makes vital improvements to respond to unmet needs as we have each time we've reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act. The provision that a minority on the Judiciary Committee have labeled controversial are in fact modest changes. They meet the genuine, unmet needs the service providers, the threats they see every day when they work with victims all over the country. Now, this is what we've done on every single VAWA reauthorization. We've looked at what we've learned since the last one, and then we take steps to recognize those victims whose needs are not being met, and we find new ways to meet them. That's nothing new or different. It's what we've always done, and it's one of the reasons, because we have improved it each time, it's one of the reasons why domestic violence has dropped. Should not be a basis for a partisan division or delay. And the legislation also includes important changes to respond to current economic realities. We all know that while the economy is now improving, there remain difficult economic times, and we have to be responsible in how we spend the taxpayers' money. That's why in our bill we consolidate 13 programs into 4. Remove duplication and bureaucratic barriers. It's another one of those things you do each time reauthorization. You try to make it better. It would cut the authorization level for VAWA by more than $135 million a year. That's a decrease of nearly 20% from the last reauthorization. It's also significant accountability provisions, audit requirements, enforcement mechanisms, restrictions on grantees and costs. Again, saying we want to do the right thing in the Violence Against Women Act, but we also want to protect the taxpayer's dollar. That's why it's a bipartisan bill. It's a product of careful consideration, and that's why it has widespread support. There's really no reason why we should not take it up and debate and pass it. The Judiciary Committee passed this bill after we considered a number of amendments, including a substitute offered by the minority. I've reached out to the distinguished ranking member, Senator Grassley, to ask about possible amendments and time agreements for consideration. We should do what we've always done ever since the first VAWA Act years ago. Pass it with strong bipartisan support. These problems are too serious for us to delay. Any one of us who served in law enforcement and gone to the scene where somebody's been severely battered, sometimes killed. I know when I've gone to those scenes, I never heard a police officer say, well, is this a Republican or a Democrat? They say, is this a victim? What do we do to help them? And that's what this is. It's not a Republican or Democratic bill. It's a sensible bill to help the victims of violence. It's crucial, common sense legislation. It's been endorsed by more than 700 state and national organizations, numerous religious and faith-based organizations, as well, of course, as our law enforcement partners. They've endorsed this bill. The last 2 times the Violence Against Women Act was reauthorized, it was unanimously approved by the Senate. Now, it seems that sometimes partisan gridlock becomes the default in the Senate in recent years. We're better than that here in the U.S. Senate. We should rise above gridlock. There's no reason why we should delay considering this bill. It has the support of 61 co-sponsors across the aisle. Let's pass it. So I said before, domestic and sexual violence know no political party. Violence happens to too many people in this country. Its victims are Republicans and Democrats. They're rich and poor, they're young and old, they're male and female, they're straight and gay. Nobody falls into a category where they are immune from this kind of violence. So let's work together. Let's pass strong VAWA reauthorization legislation. Let's do it without delay. It is a law that has saved countless lives. And for my fellow senators, I'd say it's an example of what we in the United States Senate can accomplish if we work together. And lastly, Mr. President, I know just before I came to the floor, I heard the strong support of the Paying a Fair Share Act. It's been called, I believe, the Buffett Rule. The Buffett Rule is a common-sense bill. It ensures that taxpayers at the top of the economic ladder pay at least the same tax rate that paid by hardworking, middle-class families in my state of Vermont or all other states. No longer should handsomely compensated CEOs or those who live off trust funds pay a lower effective tax rate than the people who work for them. In fact, I think it's remarkable and regrettable that such a principle of tax fairness should evoke controversy. It's more regrettable still that opponents have erected a supermajority barrier in an effort to prevent even a debate on this straightforward principle. Ready to debate to say the wealthiest will pay at least the same rate of taxes as hardworking middle America. Vote for it or vote against it. You want to say you want to vote to protect the wealthiest America, fine, and stand up and vote that way. Or vote to protect hardworking American families. But when you try to filibuster, what you're doing, you're voting maybe. You're voting maybe. Let's have the courage. Vote for the millionaires and protect them from any kind of a tax like ordinary Americans pay, or vote for ordinary Americans and say that everybody pay the same kind of tax. Vote one way or the other, but don't duck it by having a filibuster where you can say, well, I looked at it and I voted maybe. We're not elected to vote maybe. We really aren't. I'm pleased to join Senator Whitehouse and others to co-sponsor the bill. Calls for a minimum 30% income tax rate for taxpayers with adjusted gross incomes above $1 million. Says they're going to pay at least the tax rate paid by middle-class families. It also reduce the deficit by $47 billion over the next decade. Now, hard-working Vermont families and small businesses are struggling to make ends meet in a difficult economy. But tax fairness is continuing to erode, benefiting the wealthiest 1% at the expense of the rest of the country. Right now, a very large proportion of millionaires pay a smaller percentage of income than do a larger share of moderate income taxpayers. Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest people in the world, noted in a New York Times op-ed article last year, he paid taxes only 17.4% of his taxable income. As a lower percentage is paid by any of his 20 employees, they paid from 33 to 41% of their income. In fact, the nonpartisan Congressional Research Service studied these claims. They confirmed Mr. Buffett's assertion that a large portion of millionaires pay a smaller percentage of their income than average working Americans and Vermonters do. So let's end the loopholes. Tax day is upon us. Let's stand up and say we're going to end the loopholes. We're going to end these special provisions, allow some of the wealthiest to pay less than hardworking Americans. So, Mr. President, it's simply a matter of fairness. But again, let's vote yes or no. If you want to vote to protect the millionaires, then fine, vote no. If you want to say have it fair, then vote yes, but vote. Having a filibuster means you vote maybe. None of us got elected or paid to vote maybe. And I ask, Mr. President, my statements on VAWA and on the Buffett Rule appear in the record as in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I see the distinguished senior senator from West Virginia on the floor, and I see his distinguished colleague, and I believe we're still in the time reserved. No. Okay, Mr. President, I'm sorry. I see the Senator from Pennsylvania. Before I yield the floor, I would ask that there are quorum calls during this hour, the time to be divided equally.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask when time comes back to this side that first the distinguished senator from West Virginia, the senior senator, be recognized, and then the distinguished senator from West Virginia, Senator Manchin, be recognized both to speak for how long? That the time remaining to the senator from Vermont be divided between the two senators from West Virginia. I ask consent that when time is yielded back to me, the time remaining to the senator from Vermont, which will be approximately 15 minutes, be divided between the two senators from West Virginia.
Without objection.
And, Mr. President, the senator from Pennsylvania has patiently waited. I yield the floor.
The senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, I ask for unanimous consent to speak as though we're in morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise this afternoon to speak against this so-called Buffett Rule. Mr. President, this is a gimmick. It's a political gimmick. This is not a serious effort to deal with a ridiculously broken tax code. This is not a serious effort to deal with a completely broken budget. And frankly, it's very disappointing to me that we're wasting time on this instead of dealing with both of those things. We have a tax code that is ridiculous, impossible to understand, counterproductive to economic growth, badly needs a complete overhaul that would simplify this code, get rid of the many unfairnesses, lower marginal rates, broaden the base, and encourage strong economic growth. Instead, we've got this little gimmick because we don't have the political leadership to deal with the underlying real problem of a badly flawed tax code. Likewise, on budget policy, this does nothing meaningful for our massive budget deficits that we've been running. In fact, this body chooses again for the third consecutive year not to even have a budget. It's unbelievable. Instead, we're going to waste time arguing about this political stunt. Now, the President proposed a budget, at least. Unfortunately, it was not a serious budget, not a serious attempt to deal with the massive deficits we're running. It's a fourth consecutive year of trillion-dollar deficits. And instead of dealing with that, we have this gimmick. So let's be clear. This is not a serious attempt to deal with tax reform or the budget. This so-called Buffett Rule, this tax increase, would raise less than $5 billion a year. That amounts to about 0.5% of the trillion-dollar deficit that the President has proposed that we run. In fact, it would cover about 2 days' worth of the deficits that we're running for 2013. Here's a chart that illustrates the deficit that we'll have under the President's policies without the Buffett tax. Here's the deficit we'll have if we pass the Buffett tax. If you can't tell the difference, it's because there is no meaningful difference. Folks, we ought to be dealing with the real tax reform that we need to encourage economic growth and help reduce this deficit. Instead, we're wasting time with this. So since we're not doing what we ought to do, why are we having this argument? Unfortunately, it looks like it's an effort on two fronts. One is to simply engage in class warfare, generate envy and resentment, and try to use that for political gain. And secondly, it's an effort to distract from the underlying mismanagement of economic policy and fiscal policy that we have seen from this administration. Now, I know what the claim is from the other side. We hear that this is all about making sure that the rich pay their fair share. I have to say I have a little bit of trouble taking lectures on fairness from folks who think that taxpayers ought to be made to put $500 million into a solar energy company that does not have a competitive product, which drives it into bankruptcy at the cost to the taxpayers, from the same folks that want to force taxpayers to continue subsidizing plug-in cars that people don't want to buy. That kind of crony capitalism and distorting of our economy at the expense of taxpayers doesn't strike me as fairness, so I have a hard time taking a lecture on fairness from people who advocate those things. But let's look at this tax code. If we want to talk about fairness, that's fine. How about the fact that according to the Joint Committee on Taxation, almost half of all Americans today pay no income tax at all or actually receive money through the income tax code. The other half pay all of the taxes, and we're hearing from our friends that that's not enough. They need to pay still more. According to the CBO, and my second chart will illustrate this point, according to the CBO, if we look at all federal taxes, the middle quintile, the middle 20% of wage earners in America, pay about 14% as an average tax when you combine all the kinds of federal taxes that are paid. Top 1% pay 30%. So more than twice as high, 29.5 actually. If we look at just the income tax, the disparity is even bigger. If we look at the income tax alone, the middle quintile, the middle class, the middle 20%, when it comes to income tax alone, on average, pay about 3.3% as an effective average income tax rate. The top 1% pay 19%, so on average, almost 6 times as high. The fact is, we have a very progressive tax system, not just by the historical measures of our own previous tax systems, but look everywhere else in the world. In fact, the United States, according to the OECD, the U.S., has the most progressive tax system in the industrialized world. Turn this one on its side. And this is a chart that measures progressivity. Greater progressivity is in this direction, less is in this direction. As you can see, this ranking shows all of the countries in the OECD, all countries around the world, that have less progressivity than the United States does, which means that higher income Americans pay a greater share of income taxes and taxes generally than in any other country in the world. But again, we're told this is not enough. Clearly, there's something else going on here. Here's what concerns me the most. The real consequences of this so-called Buffett rule, this tax increase, is that it is meant to be a tax on investment returns. It's a tax on capital gains and dividends. It's a tax that would upend decades of established law with respect to the differentiation that we have put in place with respect to dividend income versus wage income. And it disregards the very sound reasons why we have created that distinction, one of which is that investment returns are taxed multiple times. We don't hear so much about that during this debate from my friends who are advocates for this new tax, this tax increase. But the fact is, first of all, it's only after-tax income that can be invested in the first place. So someone had to pay taxes on their earnings, and then after they've spent what they need to for their cost of living, and if they've managed to save something which they then invest, they've already paid tax on that. So now the investment that they've made, and let's say this is the investment in a corporate stock, let's keep in mind that that corporation has to pay tax before they have an opportunity to provide a return on the investment that's made. And as it happens in the United States, our corporations pay the highest corporate tax in the entire industrialized world, 35%. We've got a terrible corporate tax code. It needs to be reformed in many ways. One of them is to lower this top marginal rate, but right now it's 35%. And what the proponents of this rule are saying is that after a corporation pays that 35% tax on whatever income they can earn, and when they then choose to dividend some of that remaining after-tax income to the people who own that company, they want those owners to pay yet another tax that is even higher than what we pay now. We've got a chart here that illustrates what the net effect of this is. Given that we have a 35% top corporate tax rate, and if we were to adopt this proposal to impose this 30% minimum tax, for an individual who has dividend income, first, the company in which they invest pays a tax. Now, not all companies pay at the 35% rate, but that is the top rate, and it is in effect on many companies. Well, if the company has to pay 35% of a given $100 of income, they're left with $65 in after-corporate tax income. And if that company then decides that the people who own it ought to get a dividend reflecting their ownership, on that $65 that is available to be paid out as a dividend to investors, the proponents of the Buffett rule would have those investors pay another 30%. Well, that's $19.50, leaving the investors with $45.50 out of the $100 of income. In other words, the government takes the lion's share of the income from this investment. The net effect of that, of course, is it diminishes the incentive to make these investments in the first place. It makes other countries more attractive places to invest capital, to invest in a business, to try to generate a return. There's another aspect that's disturbing about this, which is, if you ask me, it's very reminiscent of the alternative minimum tax. Right? We tried that once. In 1969, Congress decided that there were some people that just weren't paying enough in tax, and they said, we're just going to target just a handful. Literally, there's 155 people who were, that's it. Not 155,000, 155 people who were subject to the alternative minimum tax, which was this confession of the absurdity of the tax code in the first place, right? Junk the entire existing tax code and have yet a second parallel code that will apply to just those rich 155 people. Well, guess what? Today that applies to tens of millions of Americans, and every year Congress has to do a temporary fix because it wasn't intended to do that. Well, Mr. President, I would suggest if we go down this road, we're going to find that this tax, which we're told today would only apply to millionaires and billionaires, well, pretty soon the hard, cold reality of the fact that it doesn't generate any revenue to speak of if you apply it just to millionaires and billionaires means it's going to be expanded to the middle class and far more people, very much to our detriment. Finally, let me say that it's just a bad idea to confiscate the capital, which is the lifeblood of an economy. This next chart illustrates the critical role that investment plays in economic growth and in job creation. A couple of squiggly lines, but one thing you notice if you just sort of take a quick look, there's an inverse relationship here, right? When the black line goes up, the red line's going down. The black line is investment as a percentage of our economy. And when investment climbs, the red line is unemployment. You see unemployment goes down. This is very, very well understood. It's capital invested in the economy that creates growth, creates jobs. And what this rule would do, it would impose a new layer of additionally higher taxes on that very lifeblood of our economy. It's capital also that drives wages higher. We should never forget that fact. It's capital that allows the hunter-gatherer to have a hoe and become a farmer. It's capital that allows the farmer with the hoe to cast aside the hoe and drive a tractor and become far more productive. It's capital that allows the laborer who's digging with a shovel to put aside the shovel and drive a backhoe. And as I think everybody understands or should understand, the farmer who's using a tractor is producing more and has a higher income than the poor guy who's using a hoe. And the guy who's operating a backhoe has far more income and is far more productive than the guy who's using a shovel. It's capital that makes that possible. There's a metaphor that I like about this, and I'm not sure who to credit it to. Certainly I didn't invent it, and I may not do it justice, but the gist of it is this. The comparison to the economy is that of a fruit tree. A farmer who has a fruit tree cultivates that tree so that it will produce fruit, and the fruit is the income that the farmer earns from the work he puts into cultivating the tree. Now, the government comes along and takes some of the fruit as a tax. As long as it doesn't take too much, it still makes sense for the farmer to cultivate that tree so that he can have that after-tax income. And as long as the government only takes a portion of the fruit, then the government's not diminishing the ability of the tree to produce that fruit. But if the government comes along and says, in addition to taking a whole lot of the fruit, we want to saw off a branch because we'd like some firewood. Well, now that's a whole different matter. Because whatever you think of how much of those apples or whatever the portion of that fruit you'd like to take from the farmer, once you start cutting at the tree, you're diminishing the ability of the tree to produce income for the good of the farmer and for society. That's what happens when we restrict capital. And that's what I'm afraid this is the path that we'd be going down if we adopt this. This is bad economic policy. We already have the most progressive tax code in the world and very progressive by our own historical standards. Mr. President, for the sake of job growth, economic growth, and in the hopes that we will instead have a meaningful discussion about budget policy and tax reform, I urge my colleagues to vote no today on the cloture motion on the Buffett rule, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from West Virginia.
Mr. President, 1 year ago last month, our nation lost an esteemed public servant and an outstanding human being. Judge M. Blaine Michael, who served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit for a number of years. With his passing, we were therefore left with a great void, not only on the federal judiciary, but also in the hearts of his family and his many friends. So it is with a profound sense of obligation to the people of West Virginia and America that I set out to find a nominee to fill his vacancy. My duty to provide advice and consent took on to me additional significance. In West Virginia, we are fortunate to have many talented and worthy lawyers who are capable of serving and who are willing to serve on the federal bench. But the nominee before the Senate today, Stephanie Dawn Thacker, completely stood out to me and in turn to President Obama as somebody who is uniquely qualified to carry on in her own way Judge Michael's legacy of independence, humility, intellectual honesty as a federal judge. There is no question that Stephanie Thacker has reached the heights of the legal profession, both as an award-winning public servant and also as an esteemed lawyer in private practice. And her rise is all the more impressive because of the challenges she overcame. The circumstances of Stephanie Thacker's early life were not easy. Her hometown, Hamlin, West Virginia, is in one of the poorest counties in the nation, a place where nothing is taken for granted and where every success has to be hard-earned. Stephanie credits a supportive family and community and the influence of two extraordinary and strong women who assumed her ability to achieve against the odds. While still in the crib, Stephanie's mother and grandmother told her every day that she would go to college. And then when she did, in college, they told her she would succeed in law school. They instilled in her the value of education and a strong sense of public service and duty to her country, which we fulfill again today. Ms. Thacker heeded their advice, graduating magna cum laude from Marshall University and then second in her class from West Virginia University College of Law, where she was an editor of the Law Review. Over the next 21 years, her passion and respect for the law, along with her drive to seek justice for her clients, resulted in this illustrious career. Ms. Thacker's reputation is as compassionate a person, yet tough as an attorney, who makes thoughtful, very well-researched, and therefore confident arguments that are always based upon the law and the facts in the cases. These skills and character are evident in her 12 years of service, Mr. President, as a federal prosecutor, where she rose to be Principal Deputy Chief of the Department of Justice's Child Exploitation and Obscenity Section. Among her accomplishments are prosecuting the first federal violence against women case, helping to develop the nationwide Innocence Lost initiative to combat child sex trafficking, which to date has led to the rescue of more than 1,600 children and to the conviction of more than 700 sex offenders. She co-authored the Federal Child Support Prosecution Handbook, reviewing and amending West Virginia's domestic violence laws, and prosecuting notorious child sex offender Dwight York, and of such interest to me, training national and international law enforcement officers on the prosecution of child exploitation crimes. This body of work has rightly earned her bipartisan praise from United States senators, from FBI Director Mueller, former Attorney Generals Gonzales and Ashcroft, who in fact awarded her the Distinguished Service Award, which is among the department's highest commendations. And these accomplishments are illustrative of the experience and qualifications Stephanie Thacker offers in service to the U.S. Court of Appeals of the Fourth Circuit. She has the courage to make tough decisions, and she will not back down from any challenge. She has the very superior intellect necessary to analyze the complex issues that make up the Federal Appeals Court's cases. She will look at every case with a fair and open mind and will issue opinions that are guided by our constitutional principles and always grounded in the law. And she will never forget her solemn duty to uphold fairness and justice for everyone, regardless of social status or economic means. In conclusion, Mr. President, it is with great optimism, pride, and a renewed spirit that I look to the future, knowing that this important appellate vacancy will, in fact, hopefully be filled by such a qualified person as Stephanie Dawn Thacker. I yield the floor.
Senator from West Virginia.
I rise today, first of all, to thank my senior senator,